Hi, so welcome to another Facebook Live, all about the inner critic and the process of self-shaming. So this is getting towards the end of a series of Facebook Lives that I've been making, and we've been looking at building an awareness of the processes that are involved that create the experience of shame, and looking at some tools that we can use to disengage so that we can be more confident. We've been looking a little bit at shadow and how that's connected with the critic. And what else have we done? We've been looking at criticism in relationships and how the process of internal shaming affects our relationships with others. So if you've been enjoying these lives, please remember to click to follow my page. And today's focus is going to be a little bit about how our body responds to this process of self-shaming, how the body kind of goes into stress. And I think probably the easiest way to imagine it is to think about a situation where you've been actually someone externally has been quite directly critical and judgmental. And usually that's experienced for most people as a bit of an attack. And you can even see it in people's body language when they're on the receiving end of that. There's a kind of physiological animal response to an attack. And this is because we are mammals, right? And we've got these higher brain functions, but actually beneath that in our brain, we've got the limbic system and the brain stem. We've actually physiologically got the same nervous system as the rest of mammals. So we respond, we go into a response. And so it's really important to realize this and kind of be aware of it. And it affects how we can be free of this process of criticism. So I think it's useful to think about how animals respond to something threatening. So when I was younger, I used to have a pet rabbit, and when I reached into the cage to get my pet rabbit, a few things would happen. She would, to begin with, she would often put up some aggression and then maybe run away. And then when I put my hands in a bit further and kind of captured her, she would go still as I picked her up. And then she would relax and know that it was okay. But there were those physiological responses that she went through, a fight or flight response to begin with, and then a freeze response after that. And because we are mammals, we have the same system. We have a limbic system. And although we've got higher brain functions and we can rationalize and know that we're not under threat, quite often our limbic system can get triggered into there being a threat. And we respond in the same way that the rabbit responds. Either there's a fight or flight response, or there's a freeze response. And on top of this, because we've got these higher functions, we're brilliant at imagining things, which means that we're very good at getting triggered by situations that aren't actually happening around us. They're happening in our mind's eye. And we can still have the same physiological response. So, example of a way that we might be triggered. So, for a Vietnam veteran, it might be the sound of helicopter rotors. That's the trigger, and it sends them into a memory of their experiences. They're right back to that time in Vietnam. And then for me, it might be something very simple, like being in a situation where I feel kind of exposed and vulnerable and like I'm seen. And without knowing it, of course, I'm not consciously aware, it sends me back to childhood experiences where I felt vulnerable and then I got it wrong and then I was told off. So I have this imagining of something from the past. And of course, this is the inner critic response that we've been talking about. It's I'm back in that memory and I've created this kind of memory of being judged. So in that moment, I'm kind of doing that to myself. And the important thing is there's a physiological response in my body to when I criticize myself, to when I get triggered into that memory, to those times when I go into a experience of shame. My physiology is getting affected by that. And it may go into fight and flight, but the most common response with shame is to go into a freeze. So freeze and shame are very linked together. And this is really useful to know, because we know science has understood this and knows that to move out of a freeze state, an animal actually needs to move into movement, into a sympathetic activation in order to bring its system back into regulation. So like an easier way to explain that is recently there was this situation where I was walking near where I live and there was a sheep that was caught in, she kind of caught herself in the brambles in the hedge, and I took it upon myself to go and free her because she wasn't very happy. And it was probably quite a bad idea, but anyway, I went in with my secateurs and I cut the brambles. And while I was doing it, she was in freeze response. She was totally still. And I cut the brambles and she was free. And for a while, she just stayed there. I stepped back and she didn't move. She was motionless. But then she charged across the field. She ran away and she was running around the field for quite a while. Kind of like a bucking bronco, and there was this kind of discharge, this expression, and this is what mammals do. So if they've been in a freeze, they usually move into a more sympathetic, activated state, so their body can come back into regulation. And we can learn from this. So if we are in a shame state, if we're experiencing shame, if we're stuck in that, if we're running thoughts and judgments about ourselves, one of the things that's really helpful on a physiological level is to actually do something physical with our body, to activate our nervous system. So in a way that is enjoyable and that we like. So a way that I use this, and this was very useful, very simple but very useful, is that I kind of made a rule that if I caught myself in a shame spiral in which I was judging myself, I would go outside and I would do something physical. So for me, it was usually just going for a run, or I'd shake my body a bit and, just running like 50 meters and then coming back. And this was amazingly useful. I realized that it was a really good way to break that being trapped in self-judgment or self-shaming. And but it's not easy to do, because at those times my ego really did not want to go out for a run. I was really, my energy felt pretty low. Intellectually I didn't want to do that, but by practicing that, it was a really good way for me to break myself out of that cycle. And that's something that I sometimes use if I've got into that state. And I also use it if I'm using the computer a lot. I sometimes get up and have a dance, because actually the body needs that if it's been very still for a while. So this is kind of, in a way, it's like psychological personal hygiene. It's kind of like regulating our nervous system. And it's also the other insight about this understanding of the physiology and the way that it works, which is way below the level of our consciousness. So the limbic system is getting triggered by a threat. It's not like we can kind of track that with an intellectual brain and stop that happening. It's a natural response in our physiology. And what that means is we cannot solve this from the level of the intellect. So you may be watching this live and thinking, like, great, I can really understand this process. If I understand it well enough, then I can find a way to be free of it. And that's often what we think in our mind. We really try and understand something and work it out as a way to be free. But actually that isn't possible. So, I mean, it has its use, and in these lives what I'm doing is giving a few pointers. But actually what makes the difference is doing something experiential. So that's why on our workshops we do physical processes and interacting with people and exploring, and then actually seeing within the movement what is happening, so that you can begin to track it and understand what your responses are. So having said that, if you have found this live useful, and I hope that you have, then please do share it. And I think we're coming to the end. I think there's going to be one or two more. So please do post a question if there's a question that comes up for you. But just to recap, the main points from today is that our nervous system goes into responses that we don't have control of. And a lot of those responses are generated by these internal patterns that we go into, these memories, these responses. And inner criticism is one of those. Self-shaming is one of those. And movement is a brilliant way of moving ourselves out of being stuck in a self-shaming spiral. Okay, that's all for now.